episode of Many Tribes, One Kingdom. It's your host, Dustin here, and back together again with another video from our series called History of Israel. But before I go into our specific topic for today, I want you to do me a quick favor. Please go down and hit that subscribe button and that bell notification if you haven't done so already. And also hit that like button if you like this video. And, go down to the comments section, give us any recommendations for any future videos, or see what you learned throughout this video or through any of these series. Without further ado, today specifically we will be talking about the period of the Exodus of Israel, or the tribal period. Now this period is between the exile from Israel and up until the establishment of the judges. We'll be covering that period. So that'll be between Exodus chapter 14 all the way up to Judges chapter 1. So please stick with us. There's a lot of content we're going to be covering today. However, I'm just going to be giving you a brief overview of some of the major events and major things that God is doing for the nation of Israel. I won't be going too far into detail. I'm going to give you those Bible chapters, so if you want to go deeper into those chapters or into those subjects, please be more than welcome to do so. So without further ado, we're going to start in Exodus chapter 14. And this is where the Exodus begins. And then, during this chapter, Moses splits the Red Sea and then closes it back up on the Egyptians that are following them out of Egypt. Now, this is all through the power of God, not by Moses' power. Moses has no authority or power over anything on earth outside of what God has given him to do. Now, we're going to go ahead a few chapters to Exodus chapter 16, verses 22 through 36, in which God establishes the Sabbath day as a formal day of rest for the nation of Israel. Then in the next chapter, in chapter 17, Moses disobeys God and hits a rock too many times because the people of Israel were just annoying him, because he kept complaining about the conditions that they were in. And so Moses hits the rock too many times outside of what God had told him to do. And this actually causes Moses to lose out on the opportunity to see the promised land. Now we're going to go down to verses 8 through 16, in which the war for the promised land begins with the defense against the Amalekites. And now going over to Exodus 19, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the commandments. So this is Exodus 19 and 20, in which God is giving the commandments to Moses. Then in Exodus chapters 21 through 23, Moses gives the law to the people. In Exodus 24, God establishes a covenant with his people. And Exodus 25, it talks about how to make offerings to God. And in verses 10 through 23, God also gives instructions on how to build the Ark of the Covenant. Now we're going to go over to chapter 25, verses 23 through 31. God describes the building of his temple as well as how the priesthood is to look. As the critical part, because this is the first time we're seeing God actually establish the church, or establish a form of people a more formal side of how people were supposed to worship him, or the more formal side of it, like the temple and the priesthood, which mirrors a lot to what we see today in modern churches. In chapter 32, the people build a golden calf after the disappearance of Moses, at least in the eyes of the people who were not on Mount Sinai. And so after that long period, the people just said, well, we're going to give up. We're going to build a golden calf and worship it, all except for the Levites, which we're going to get later down the road. And then also later on in this chapter, Moses breaks the tablets that God had given him on Mount Sinai. In chapter 34, God replaces the tablets that Moses had broken out of anger. And then going down to verses 10 through 28, God renews the covenant with his people. And in chapters, so now down to chapters 36 through to 38, we see the building and the completion of the first temple, or first tabernacle. Now we're going to go to Leviticus chapters 1 through 9. The law and the offering are established. We see this again through chapters 11 through the end of the chapter in chapter 27. Beginning in Numbers 1 and 2, we see a census being taken and the organization of the tribes being established. Now in chapter 3, we see the Levites are established as the royal priesthood because of their loyalty to God, and not in that they did not build the or take part in the building of the golden calf. However, this does have this does have one drawback for the Levites. Yes, they are receiving this great responsibility, but they will not be able to inherit any land in the promised land. They won't have a large swath of land that they will control. But there will be more on that later on. Chapter 6, we see the law of the Nazarites being given to Israel through Moses from God. Now, this order of the Nazarites is a sacred order of people who will see prominent figures come from this order. Chapter 8, verses 5 through 22, we see the ceremonial cleansing of the Levitical priests. This is what ceremonies they will have to perform to become clean in order to enter into the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God resides. In chapter 9, verses 1 through 14, we see the Passover being established as a formal celebration or holiday that is going to be celebrated on a more regular basis. Chapter 10, verses 11 through 36, we see the tribes of Israel now begin to leave the area of Sinai. Chapter 13, Israel sends out spies from among the tribes out to the promised land to more scope it out to see who is residing there, to make a plan of attack and hopefully get things set right for the coming invasion and eventually takeover of Israel, or the nation promised to God, from God to Israel. In chapter 16, we see that a man named Korah rebels against Moses because of how Moses and some other members, some of his family and others, are being held up higher than the other nations, other tribes, and other people in the tribes of Israel. He didn't like that, and he felt that he was being disrespected, and those people were being disrespected. But God quickly put an end to that. And then in verses 41 and 50 through 51, we see that a plague strikes the nation of Israel and wipes out a portion of the people. Chapter 18, we see the duties and portions given to the Levites. Chapter 20, we see the death of Moses' sister named Miriam. Chapter 21, the war continues in Israel. So they're continuing this attack, but now it's beginning against the Canaanites and the other kings in Israel, and in the current or the area to which it was promised to them. In chapter 26, we see another census taken, but this is of the newer generation of the tribes of Israel. In chapter 27, verses 15 through 23, God has told Moses that Joshua is going to follow in his place and will come to take over leadership of the nations of Israel upon the death of Moses. In chapter 32, we see that the promised land begins to be settled by the tribes of Israel. Chapter 34, we see Moses is given a layout of the promised land in order of the tribes. In chapter 35, cities are given to the Levites. However, this is where the area we talked about earlier, there's no swaths of land given to the Levites. However, they were given cities to reside in, which were called the cities of refuge. In most of the books of Deuteronomy, they were just really a recap of what took place during the period of the Exodus and in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. You'll see a lot of overlap in those, a lot of overlaps of those events taking place in Deuteronomy. In chapter 34, Moses dies. So now Joshua now takes over as the leader of Israel, which is formalized in chapter 1 of Joshua, the book of Joshua. Then in chapters 2 through 6, Israel sends out spies and eventually takes over the city of Jericho. Chapters 13 through 21, Israel divides the Canaanite territories among the tribes. So this is the fulfillment of God's promise to the to the tribes of Israel. This is when and this is the more formalized section. I know we talked about earlier, there may have been like some overlap where I said that the land was beginning to be settled. Yes, it was beginning to be settled, but there was no formalized layout of how the nation was to be settled, or how the promised land was supposed to be settled. And then we see in Judges chapter 1, Joshua dies, which brings an end to the period of the Exodus, or the tribal period, in which you can go back and watch John's video. I highly recommend it. He goes throughout the book of Judges and talks about this period of Israel's history. This concludes this video of the tribal period. I hope you have a wonderful day and that you learned something new. And if you have, please go down in that comments section and let us know what you learned. And if you have any questions or concerns about anything I said in this video, please, again, go down in the comments section or email us. You will see the link or our email at the end of this video in the outro. Thank you, guys, and God bless you.